The first burden is the burden of being unforgiven. The burden of being unforgiven. It was the burden of being unforgiven that caused David to write this psalm. He was aware of his sin and it bothered him. When we are aware of our sins, it bothers us and it troubles us and it burdens us. But sin is a variable burden. Not everybody is bothered by sin, and we are not bothered by every sin we do equally. There are many variables that affect the burden of sin, but let me point to two. The burden of sin changes with the perception and the reality of the offendee. First, let's look at the perception of the offendee. So if we did a sin to somebody, sin against somebody, based on what we think about them, the burden of sin increases or decreases. So if I think that I am somebody and I sin against somebody else, then because I think I'm somebody, I'm not really bothered by the sin. Or if I think that the other person is a nobody, whether they are a nobody or not, if I think they're a nobody, then I'm not bothered by the sin because my perception of the offendee is such. The classic example is what has happened in the recent past, where men in power have abused their positions and abused their subordinates. Why? Because they thought that they were somebody, and they thought that the other person was a nobody. And so their perception of the offendee caused them to abuse them and sin and not have the burden of sin. Second is the reality of the offendee. It is a burden depending on who we have offended. So the burden of sin depends on the status of the offendee. The classic example has been given by John Phillips in his book Exploring Romans, where he said, suppose a hot-tempered Marine struck a fellow Marine in his barracks. He may get a few days detention. Suppose he struck his sergeant. He may get a few weeks detention. Suppose he struck his commanding officer. He would get a few months detention. But suppose he attempted to strike the visiting president of the United States, he may be executed on the spot. You see, the crime is the same, one fellow man striking another fellow man. But depending on the status and the dignity of the offendee, the punishment changes. And therefore, the guilt changes depending on who the offendee is. The reality is that all sin is against God. So in Psalm chapter 51, verse 4, David said, against you, you only have I sinned. How did he sin against God? He sinned against Bathsheba because he thought that he was somebody. He sinned against Uriah because he thought that Uriah was a nobody. How did he sin against God? Because all sin at the end is against God. The more we realize this, the burden of even the smallest sin then increases infinitely because God is infinite. So any sin against your neighbor is a sin against God. Any sin against your colleague is a sin against God. Any sin against your family member is a sin against God. Any sin against a fellow believer is a sin against God. Any sin against yourself is a sin against God, and the burden rises infinitely because the offendee's status and dignity is infinite. Hence the need for constant forgiveness. If we have not asked for forgiveness, we carry around the burden of unforgiven sin. And so in Psalm 51, verse 3, it reads, "For I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me." I know my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Unforgiven sin is always in front of your face. If you have not read the tragedy by William Shakespeare called Macbeth, let me just give you a gist of it. Macbeth was a warrior. He was second in command. He went out and did some wars. He won wars, and on his way back, he was met by 3 witches who prophesied that he would become king. And based on the prophecy and at the behest of his wife, he goes and kills his lord, King Duncan. And he is traumatized by this. He has a guilty conscience with it. And several days later, he keeps waking up in the middle of the night and asks this question: where is that knocking coming from? What is happening to me that I am frightened of every noise? Whose hands are these? Will all great Neptune's oceans wash this blood clean from my hand? No, instead my hands will stain the sea's scarlet, turning the green waters red. We carry around the guilt of unforgiven sin.